Have you ever looked at a company and wondered how they just seem to navigate a crisis so smoothly, while another one completely stumbles at the first sign of trouble? Well, a lot of the time, it all comes down to how they see risk. Do they see it as a bunch of separate little threats or as part of a much bigger interconnected picture? Today, we're going to dig into that, the huge difference between traditional risk management and what's called enterprise risk management.
But first, let's just zoom out for a second and ask a really basic question. Why do so many plans fail? I mean, in business, in life, you name it. More often than not, the answer is all about how we deal with the unexpected. In other words, how we manage risk.
Okay, so let's get on the same page here. What even is risk? When you boil it all down, it's really just the gap between what you want to achieve, your goals, and the big, uncertain future that stands in your way.
Now, here's the more formal definition, and what's so interesting about it is that it has two essential ingredients. First, you need a future, which by its very nature is uncertain, and second, you need an objective, something you're actually trying to do. If you don't have both of those, you literally can't have risk.
So this is the crucial takeaway right here. If you don't have a goal, you don't have risk. It's like if you're just wandering around with no destination in mind, you can't really get lost, can you? Risk is fundamentally 100% tied to chasing after some kind of objective. It's the chance you might not make it there.
So for a long time, organizations have tried to handle all this uncertainty using a pretty specific playbook. We can call it the traditional approach. And really, it's like trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle by just looking at one piece at a time, completely in isolation.
This traditional way of doing things is just called risk management, or RM, and it's a very structured step-by-step process. A team identifies a potential risk, they try to figure out how bad it could be, they come up with a plan to make it less bad, and then they just keep an eye on it and report back. It's all very logical, very methodical.
And hey, let's be clear, this process isn't useless. Not at all. It actually works up to a point. I mean, studies have shown it can add a solid 20 to 30% more shareholder value. It means fewer nasty surprises, and it absolutely helps companies make smarter decisions. But it has a huge, fundamental flaw. And that brings us right back to that puzzle analogy. This is the problem with only looking at the individual pieces. The old way is broken because it lives in these imaginary boxes called silos, and that's just not how the real world operates.
So, a siloed view treats something like credit risk as its own little island, totally separate from, say, operational risk. But in reality, come on, we know it's a mess. Everything is connected. A major credit issue could instantly become a liquidity crisis. A hurricane doesn't just mess with your operations, it hits every single risk a company faces. The bottom line is, risks just don't care about our neat little departmental charts.
This is what the experts call correlated risk. It's basically a domino effect. When one single bad thing happens, it triggers this cascade of other bad things. The hurricane is a perfect example. It's not just wind damage, right? It's power outages, it's broken supply chains, it's employees' safety, it's everything all at once from one single event.
And if you want the ultimate, most dramatic case study of this ever, you just have to look at the 2008 financial crisis. You had banks managing credit risk in one silo and market risk in another, and they completely missed how a problem in the housing market could set off a catastrophic, correlated collapse across the entire planet.
So if the old way is broken, what's the fix? Well, it's a whole new way of thinking called enterprise risk management, or ERM, and it's all about finally seeing the entire puzzle, not just the little pieces.
ERM is not just another process. The source material calls it an architecture, or my favorite, the binding glue. It's a company-wide framework that ties all those separate risk activities into one single cohesive strategy that starts at the very top of the company.
Now, you're going to see the same basic steps here: identify, measure, mitigate, all that stuff. But the difference, the real magic, isn't in the steps themselves. It's in that last one, repeat. In ERM, this isn't some checklist you do once. It's a continuous loop that becomes part of the company's DNA, part of its everyday culture.
But look, having a great framework on paper is one thing. For ERM to actually work, it needs a serious, deep commitment from the whole organization. And that commitment has to start right in the boardroom.
Yet for this company-wide view to have any chance, the accountability has to begin at the very highest level. Getting ERM right isn't just a task for managers, it's a core responsibility of leadership.
So what does that look like? Well, for the board of directors, it means they're on the hook for the big picture. They have to provide that overall oversight, create the policies, and this is a big one, define the company's risk appetite.
which is just a fancy way of saying how much risk they're willing to take on. And then, of course, they have to make sure everyone's actually following the rules.
And working hand in glove with the board is the CEO. The source materials says it perfectly. The tone from the top at CEO level makes lots of difference. It's so true. It can't just be a memo. It has to be a constant message. When the CEO truly champions a culture of being smart about risk, that attitude flows down to everyone.
Now, to turn this whole vision into a day-to-day reality, companies rely on a really important executive, the Chief Risk Officer, or CRO. This is the person who's actually in charge of making it all happen, implementing the policies, overseeing the teams. You can think of them as the conductor of the entire risk orchestra.
Okay, so after all of that, what's the big takeaway here? It really boils down to a fundamental shift in how you see the world. It's about moving from a fragmented, piece-by-piece view of risk to a focused, holistic one.
And this chart just lays it all out so clearly. Traditional RM is fragmented and siloed. ERM is holistic and company-wide. RM is just a process. ERM is an entire architecture. With RM, risk is some department's job. With ERM, it's everybody's job, from the top to the bottom. It's the difference between stamping out individual fires and managing the risk of the whole forest.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. In a world that is just getting more and more uncertain and interconnected, trying to manage just the pieces of the puzzle isn't going to cut it anymore. The real question you should be asking in your company or even in your own life is, are you just seeing the pieces, or are you finally seeing the whole picture?